Hey everyone, today we're going to be covering the second part of the Daylight Iceberg. This video is going to cover tiers 4 to 7, probably. So to start off, we have lore contradictions. Now this is a relatively simple one. It's simply the fact that in the lore there are a lot of contradictions, lots of things throughout the years that haven't quite lined up. An early one I remember is with Billy and his parents. Originally, they were called the Adams, and there isn't really much evidence elsewhere to suggest they were called this, but in some entries they were called the Adams. I think it was the original lore entry. Currently, they're called the Thompsons, hence the Thompson House, and on Coldwind Farm, and stuff like that. It's an old lore contradiction. This also extends to other killers as well, though. For example, the Trapper. Originally in his lore there was some contradiction over whether it was him or his father who caused the mining accident. And the new lore brought in, I'm not sure when it was, I think it was around 2020, 2019, somewhere like that, specified that it was Trapper. But originally there was a bit of a contradiction, a bit of uncertainty about who it actually was. Another one is with Nurse, between her base lore and her tome lore. It's a bit unclear which of her lore is the true one almost. They can sort of align, but there's inconsistency between them. Her tome lore makes out that she kills people by injecting them with some kind of lethal substance. But her base lore sort of makes out that she went around strangling people. But then she also wields her bone saw in game. So there's sort of these three different methods, and none of them are particularly clear. The other one, of course, is by burning. Nurse's lore, in fact, is all a bit of a contradictory mess. The whole burning of Crotus Prenisylum is sort of unclear. We don't really know what happened there specifically. Who burned it, it's not really too clear. So that's lore contradictions. There's many of them, and they come in all shapes and sizes. Next up we have the Teacher, and the Teacher is a fake killer. That's right, a fake killer. It's a killer in the game files that the devs actually planted there in order for data miners to find. It was bait, basically. A false killer very early into the game. I think this was as far back as 2016, maybe 2017. But it's a killer they planted in the game files to throw people off. I think it was around the time of Nurse. Actually, maybe it was Doctor. It could have been Doctor. It was somewhere around that early period. But it was a character they put into the game files. They had, I think, a power or a power icon. They had a power icon, and they had some add-ons and I think a perk called Underperform. But the whole thing was just completely fake, basically. It was just a fabrication to bait people and to sort of get them hyped, but also to throw leakers or data miners off, basically. Bubba makes the survivor pudding. Now, this is a theory that is what it sounds like, basically. That Bubba makes the survivor pudding. The survivor pudding the killers can use in-game is made by Bubba. And this is a theory that comes from the fact that Bubba released shortly after the survivor pudding did. They released around the same time. The survivor pudding came out, I think it was the first year or the second year anniversary, something like that. And Bubba came out shortly after. But that's all the theory is. Obviously, Bubba is a person who consumes other people, so that's obviously going to be a connection there as well. But the core theory is just that he makes it. Originally in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's actually one of his relatives, the cook. But in-game, obviously, he doesn't have the cook, and so perhaps he resorts to making his own sort of chili, or survivor pudding in this case. Mori animation spam refers to the original ability to spam the Mori animation. This could be done because you actually needed to charge up a bar when you did a Mori. But what this did originally was that when you started charging the bar, the first part of the animation played. So a pretty common one for this was with Bubba, where you could charge up the bar to almost full, and Bubba would just repeatedly smack the survivor over the head, but you never actually moried them because you cancelled it at the very last second, so you just repeatedly sort of slammed them on the head. And it was a form of, but it was a form of BMing or whatever you want to call it. Long Arms Freddy refers to the fact that everyone thought Freddy had very long arms originally. This was back in the days where the hitboxes were a little bit worse, and Freddy in particular, due to being so short, always seemed like he was hitting you when he was way too far away. But this was just an issue because his weapon is obviously attached to his hand, whereas most other killers wield it and it's a longer sort of item. Therefore, it always looked a bit off whenever Freddy hit you because he would swing and his arm would go out and it never seemed to quite connect. But this wasn't actually like a problem. It wasn't Freddy didn't actually have longer arms or a longer reach than anyone else. He was simply just acting in this way because of his hand being his weapon, essentially. So everyone always thought he had very long arms or he could reach further than other killers. This was all just a myth, it wasn't true. He had the same lunge range as everyone else. The Knight kill switch refers to the fact that Knight was kill switched, and it was a more important kill switch. This happened in early 2024, I think, and Knight was kill switched for a very long time. I think it was at least a month, it might have been nearing 2 months even. And he had an issue, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's more about the fact that he was kill switched for such a long time. It was a really long kill switch, longer than I think anyone else, especially a character. The only other one I can think of is when Nurse was kill switched for quite a long time. But this Knight one was very, very long. It was sort of abnormally long. Noam Chomsky refers to a special event in the game that I don't think ever even got an announcement. During this event, a gnome would spawn from the Left 4 Dead games, and I think originally from Half-Life, called Noam Chomsky. This was a little gnome that would appear in the endgame. When the endgame started, you'd hear this laugh, and then somewhere in the map, Noam Chomsky would spawn. All you had to do was run up to him and kick him or stomp on him, depending if you were a survivor or killer, and after the game, you would unlock the Noam Chomsky charm. And that's all the event was, really. It was a very simple event, but it was this sort of special event going on. I think it lasted a couple weeks to a month, and because they never announced it, everyone was very confused. I remember I was very confused when it first started. Unfinished Bubba chapter refers to the fact that Bubba's chapter was not finished, seemingly. Now this happened seemingly because Bubba, Freddy, and the Saw chapter all released very close together, all within a 4-month span, which is obviously quite abnormal looking at today's chapter release schedules, right? We get one pretty solidly every 3 months. But in this case, we got Bubba, and then a month later, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and then I think 2 months later we got Saw. So it was this very intensive period where it seemed like behavior was really churning out these licenses. And it was sort of theorized that this was because they just had all these offers and they decided to take them all on. But the issue is that this caused problems. Specifically for Bubba's chapter. Bubba's chapter seemed really unfinished. For one, it was just Bubba. There was no survivor, there was no map, just Bubba. And Bubba also didn't have a very complex power. It was very simplistic. All it was a simple chainsaw charge type of thing. Not only this, but his add-ons weren't even his. His add-ons were entirely pulled from Billy, the other chainsaw character. So Bubba came into the game and his chainsaw was sort of very simplistic, quite boring, and all of his add-ons didn't even really fit his power beyond the fact that it was a chainsaw. He had like stealth add-ons and stuff like that, add-ons that just don't really make much sense for Bubba because he's too slow, compared to Billy, who could make use out of these some stealth-based add-ons, because he obviously is very quick, he can be stealthy, charge in, and do some damage. Bubba just couldn't do that, So a lot of his add-ons just don't make sense. It was only a couple years later, I think it was 2020, so this is almost like 2 to 3 years on from his release, where he actually got a full set of refreshed and original add-ons. He got his chili add-ons and stuff like that we have now and are considered sort of normal. Another thought that just popped into my head, this is really random, I'm sorry, it's not actually on the iceberg, but I do want to mention it. And that's the fact that originally, not all characters actually had iridescent add-ons. And ones who did, some of them only had one iridescent add-on. For example, Huntress, for a long time, up until I think about 2020 as well, had just iridescent head. It was only when they reworked her add-ons, and they started normalizing the fact that every killer gets 2 iridescent add-ons, that she also got her soldier's putty. But before that, it was just one iridescent add-on. And for some characters, I believe both Billy and Bubba, which is why I remembered this, didn't have any iridescent add-ons. Now, correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure their highest were purples. And I always thought that was really odd. Back in those days, some of them didn't have iridescent add-ons, and some of them just had one. It was really bizarre, but that's how it was. Greenville Cinema Film refers to the fact that if you repair the generator in the main building of Greenville Cinema, or Greenville Square, the map, a film will play on the cinema screen. So if you repair the generator up in the projection room, it will project a film, essentially. And this film is of the casting of Frank Stone and the mill that appears in it. And it was sort of just this early Easter egg for the game, but also a nice cool Easter egg for DBD as well, and it's sort of a connecting factor. The entity didn't take Myers. This is a theory that Myers simply walked into the entity's realm. It's a fairly popular one, it's one you've probably heard, but it's the idea that Myers wasn't actually invited to the realm, and this is because if you check out his lore, there's actually no indication or note of the entity reaching out or there ever being that connection there. So Myers' presence in the realm doesn't make all too much sense. Why is he there? One big theory is that the entity was going after Laurie, and so whilst chasing Laurie, hunting down his obsession, he simply got taken as well. He followed her into the fog, whether this was intentional for the entity or not. The core reason behind people thinking this, though, aside there being no evidence, is the fact that Benedict Baker, in his original entry on Myers, seemed to refer to the fact that he wasn't even sure how Myers had got here, and wasn't sure he was meant to be there. There's sort of this moment where Benedict seems to think Myers made the decision to come to the realm, it wasn't the entity. Let me read it here quickly. Something or rather someone is here now. I've never seen this shape before. A man hiding behind a mask. He comes with a determination, but more worrying, he comes with an apparent grasp of the hunt. He does not strike me as someone who even went unwillingly to this place. Is there more to this being than I can fathom? So it's sort of this moment that sounds like Myers made the decision to come here, and not the entity. Obviously this is just Benedict's speculation, it's not confirmation of anything, but it is very interesting nonetheless. The real Alex refers to the fact that Alex, referred to in Alex's toolbox, was actually a developer on the game. They were an employee at Behavior named Alex, and they liked to use toolboxes and sabotage a lot. I forget specifically what their role was on the game, but that's the vague story behind it. It's actually a reference to a developer. Although it is nice to think that there is also a lore character or a realm character who was called Alex as well. Removed map offerings refers to the map offerings that got removed, and these were the different tiers or rarity map offerings. These were the brown map offerings and the yellow map offerings. If you didn't know, there were originally brown and yellow map offerings for every map or realm, and these each specifically had lower odds than the green. The green one has ridiculously high odds. It's like 900, it's like 9,999%. But then the yellow had like 50 and the brown one had like 10 or something. I don't remember exactly, but it was around that. And basically, these offerings existed, and for a long time they were actually usable. Even though they got retired, you could still use them if you had them in your inventory. But eventually they got rid of this. I think it was around 2021, 2022. They actually finally put a stop to it and said you couldn't use them. They weren't too useful in comparison to the greens, which is seemingly why they did this, is to just decide, well, if you want to choose a map, you get a guarantee, or you get a near guarantee, depending if multiple people play it, right? Old Tinkerer refers to the fact that Tinkerer used to be completely different. It was a completely different perk. Old Tinkerer didn't have the undetectable status in it at all, and it actually made your power-related abilities more effective. The most famous case of this is with Huntress and her machine gun build. It basically sped up your power charge times, or it made them more effective. It was something along those lines. So when you had her hatchet wind-up add-ons on and Tinkerer, it basically amplified them. It made her wind up really quickly, and you could almost rapid fire the hatchets. You could also do this with Billy, I believe, as well. It was sort of Instasaw Billy or Cracked Billy, where you could charge his chainsaw very quickly with, I think his engravings were the original ones, and pair this up with Tinkerer, and it made it very, very speedy. So that's what that is. It was a big meta at the time. It sort of broke the game, which is why it's on here. Reverse Chainsaw into Quinton is one you've probably heard. It's a relatively famous DBD meme, and it just comes from a clip of Otzdava playing the game, and he does this really bizarre move where he predicts where a Quinton is. He's playing Billy, and he does a move where he reverse chainsaws into a Quinton hiding in a corner. And it just became sort of a meme because of that, because it was such a bizarre situation. And it was just very funny. That's all that is. The Konami code is a special code that came along with the Silent Hill chapter, and this is doable in the main or lobby screen of the game. If you type in the Konami code, which is a famous sort of gaming code, you'll get a tune to play, and you'll unlock a Vic Viper charm, which is this ship from another Konami game. That's all that really is. I think the only prerequisite is you have to own the Silent Hill chapter, and other than that, you just have to type in the code, and that's it. The Lost Tapes refers to the characters featured on the Universal perks. These are the perks available to all the characters. On the Survivor side, there's characters quoted underneath these perks that we don't know. Characters like Dylan, Sujin, and so on. Characters we never see in-game, but they're appearing on quotes on these lost tapes. It's quoted as lost tapes next to the quotes. And the theory behind this is that these are old survivors of the realm. All that's left of them now are their perks, or their originally probably teachables, with their face remaining on some of them having different icons. But it's all that remains of them now, with them now likely being in the void. They were simply old iterations of realm survivors, people who once filled the realms, people who once filled the trials, who are now in the void, dead and gone. FNAF cope refers to the fact that for years and years, people were really coping when it came to Five Nights at Freddy's. No matter what was released or what teasers were made, people would always bend it somehow to fit Five Nights at Freddy's. The most sort of egregious case of this, I think, was with the Hellraiser chapter. When they released the trailer, it was sort of this flickering TV, and in the corner of the TV it said 1987. And people took this to mean that it was the bite of 87, and that these were like security monitors relating to Five Nights at Freddy's. It turns out the monitor was projecting images that related specifically to the film Hellraiser, and Hellraiser came out in 1987, so it was clearly a Hellraiser teaser. But people went on to say, oh, they tried to bait FNAF on purpose. They knew what they were doing, even when they were just, faithfully recreating a scene almost from the Hellraiser film. So it's this thing where no matter what, people were coping for Five Nights at Freddy's, taking things that were almost guaranteed to be something else, and twisting it to fit Five Nights at Freddy's. So it was just quite funny. Obviously now we're getting Five Nights at Freddy's, and it's coming in June of 2025, seemingly, or summer, somewhere in the summer. Hawkins Lab Secret Room refers to an Easter egg in the Hawkins Lab map. If you go over to one of the basement spawns, it has to be, it's one close to the portal room. And you need the basement not to be there, so the area is closed off. And when this happens, you can use Nurse and blink inside the room. And inside there's a bunch of stuff around. There's like a body on the floor. There's a bunch of sort of equations and sort of these molecule formulations. And if you figure it out, it spells out polyester. And also tells you where the golden toolbox is in the map. And this refers to the creator Polyester, who frequently hunts the golden toolboxes and other secrets within DBD. So this was a nice sort of nod toward him. He's also a fog whisperer, of course, and he's relatively sort of famous within the community. You probably know who he is. So yeah, it was this nice little nod toward Polyester, which was very sweet, I think. DS dribbling refers to how DS originally worked, and this was that it took a few seconds to actually trigger after being picked up, and I think you had to wiggle to a certain point as well. This meant that you could pick someone up as killer, walk a bit, drop them, and you could actually stop them from using their DS. So this became a really common strategy, where you'd pick someone up, walk a bit, drop them, pick them up, walk a bit, drop them, and you could do this over and over, and it basically stopped or halted the DS timer. And back in those days, that worked, so good for them, I guess. DS was very oppressive back then, so having this way around it was a pretty big deal. Finally, in this tier, we have Sable was created by the entity. This is simply how it sounds. This is the theory that Sable was created by the entity. And this comes about because Sable is sort of strange in a lot of ways. She doesn't quite make sense. For one, her story seems to insert itself into Michaela's. Michaela's story never mentions her, despite them seemingly being best friends. Michaela never seems to mention her. It's quite odd. She does mention her roommate Julian, but she never mentions Sable. Whereas Sable is going on about how Michaela and her are friends, how she was talking to her around the time of her writing her story, which ended her up in the realm, which is what her lore is about. So it's sort of strange. It's this overlap, but there's not any moment of connection. It's quite bizarre. And Sable is also written as this sort of overly kind of like edgy or dark character. She goes on about, I'm not like everyone else, I like bugs and stuff like that. It's all that kind of stuff. It's very sort of cliche in many parts. So people sort of took that to mean that, oh, maybe she's like this entity creation. It's like she's created by someone who doesn't quite understand humanity and is sort of overcome with the darkness. So when they make a person, it ends up being someone like Sable, which is a bit ridiculous. I know it's a bit silly. But it's also for the fact that it could be a means to try and manipulate Michaela, almost planting this character into her mind, because Michaela's so strong in the realm with her boons. So planting a character for her to care for, who's now in the trials with her, is going to make her feel more emotion and make her more sort of worthwhile to the entity. So it's a bit of a stretch of a theory. There's not really any actual evidence aside the fact that their laws don't really, or that Michaela's law doesn't mention her. But this realistically can just be played off for the fact that They hadn't planned Sable at that point, and they decided to have them be friends later on. Hooks don't repair refers to the fact that originally hooks didn't actually repair when you sabotage them. This meant when you used a toolbox or the perk Saboteur and you broke a hook, the hook would actually never respawn. It would just stay permanently broken, so that was pretty broken in itself. Hidden cosmetics. Now, this is a bit of a debatable one. They're not technically hidden, but they are sort of hidden away from direct view. These are cosmetics that come in different parts. For example, a character like the Doctor has certain cosmetics only for his body, but because when you go on the store, you see all the outfits at first, you never actually really see these. Even if you do click on the individual part, like the torso, they're always at the very bottom, typically, because they're lower rarity cosmetics, so you often don't actually see them. But there's lots of cosmetics in the game you've probably never seen because they're sort of hidden away at the bottoms of pages or not in the primary outfit slots because they don't count as outfits. There's also other ones that come as sort of additional gifts with DLCs when you purchase them. For example, when you buy the Ash vs. Evil Dead DLC, you'll actually get a second hand for Ash, a blue one, just a blue recolor of his red base one. And this is the case for most characters as well, or most chapters. You get like a special secret cosmetic almost that comes alongside them. But for many characters, you've maybe never seen these because they're sort of rare, they don't appear too much, and they're also quite hard to distinguish from just the base version. So that's what that is. Next up, we have everything is the entity, and this refers to the fact that in the realm, everything is the entity. That's what that is. That's sort of the whole theory, or the whole idea. Everything in the realm is built up of entity cells or auric cells, and everything inside the realm is also a part of the entity. The entity, after all, is almost a collective consciousness of all those it absorbs. So everything it's absorbed is also itself, kind of. So everything it's absorbed is also itself, kind of. All of it together is one. You can sort of see this in maps like RPD2, where it seems like the map is too big or it's too much of a strain to hold it, and you can see in the walls of the trials it's sort of exploding with what looks to be auric cells. And so the idea is that everything in the trials, the survivors, the killers, everything is made up of the entity and the cells. So when you're running across the ground in a trial, you're running on the entity. When you're repairing a generator, you're repairing the entity, and so on. Alpha Survivors is the original survivors we saw in the launch trailer of the game, and also in the alpha builds of the game. These were the characters that looked completely different from the original 4 characters, or 4 survivors we got in the game. It's a bit bizarre why they changed some of these. For example, there's a white version of Claudette, and there's a black version of Meg, and they, for whatever reason, switched their ethnicities when the game launched. There's also another sort of tattooed character that potentially became Jake, or maybe Dwight, and then there was another character too, I think. You can see them in all the old alpha or even beta artwork, maybe. But they're just these different original 4 characters than what we ended up getting. And they actually feature in the launch trailer of the game too, which is obviously quite odd, because if you watch the trailer, then you go and play the game, you'll see that those characters aren't there. Maybe they're also in the void, or were part of those lost tape characters too. The third way to escape the trials is an ongoing secret, and this is something the developers apparently mentioned, that there's a third way to escape the trials. Currently we know of 2, the exit gates and the hatch, but the developers hinted at the fact that there was a third way to escape too, a secret way that no one has yet found. And that's been the case for years now. I think they said it maybe up to 6 or 7 years ago now. It's a bit tough because no one actually has the clip of them saying it, so it's sort of hearsay as well. But it does seem to be remembered among community members. To mention polyester again, I remember in the comments of a Minskull video who covered this third way to escape topic, he mentioned that back in the day he remembers hunting the third way to escape. So, you know, I trust his word on that, and I think that was the case. I think the developers at some point did say something about a third way to escape the trials. Sharp Hand Joe is a silly meme about Freddy, and it's just this sort of like low res Freddy image. I think it's for like a toy. It's like one of those knockoff toys. And it's just memeing on the fact that in DBD we got Sharp Hand Joe, we didn't get Freddy. We got this sort of like knockoff, nerf down version of him. That's all that really is. It's a bit of a meme about Freddy and how he never quite lived up to his expectations. Stretched res is in reference to how stretched res was originally possible in the game. This is the process of stretching your resolution, which allows you to essentially stretch out your image of the game to be sort of like wider or narrower. And the issue with this was that it actually sort of broke the game a bit. It allowed some players, based on your resolution, to sort of see over certain loops on tiles, or basically get a competitive advantage. So this was eventually patched by behavior by them adding two black bars on the top of the screen and the lower portion of the screen. This meant if you did change your resolution, it blocked off the part that would have aided you, essentially. So if you do just like it that way, you can still kind of do it, but obviously you're going to not get that advantage because the black bars block it off. Nurse X Wraith refers to the very real, not theory, but fact, that Nurse and Wraith have something for one another, likely romantic in the entity's realm. And this is coming directly from a developer saying this, and alongside the cosmetic drop for both Nurse and Wraith around Valentine's Day. And it's the set where Wraith has a weapon with Nurse's heart sort of embedded in his weapon, and Nurse is missing her heart in her outfit. So the suggestion here is that they have something for one another, sort of romantically, and they share a love of some form. And it does sort of make sense lore-wise too, because these two characters are some of the most human, which is another thing the developers have said. I believe they said it was Wraith, Nurse, Hag, Spirit, and someone else who were the most human or had the most humanity remaining. So it makes sense that these two characters can sort of find some solace with their love. I'm sure they're not like literally going around, you know, kissing and you know, all that kind of stuff. I think it's mainly a sort of like a symbolic love. It's almost like this deeper connection, or it's this shared trauma almost. That, you know, it's a connection. There's maybe some love to it, but it's probably not like, you know, like physically romantic, right? I don't think it's, you know, that doesn't make much sense to me. You are the entity is a very popular theory, and goes that we as the player are the entity. And this is because the entity in the realm is this creature that controls the trials. It causes them to continue. And we as the player are a large proponent of that. We're the ones that load up the game, we're the ones that select survivors to enter the trials, or control killers to enter the trials. And obviously there's the whole other theory that the red stain looking out from the killers is the entity. And so if that was the case, then that would be us, because we look out of the killer's eyes when we play them. So it's this overall idea that we as the player are the entity. There's lots of different evidence for this, but that's sort of the core of it. It's a fairly like simple, straightforward theory. There's also things like the killers performing to us in the lobby screen, like Trickster winking at us, for example, looking back and winking at the player. during the lobby sort of start screen or lobby screen before you enter the game. And it's sort of this idea that they're sort of paying tribute to you as the entity almost. Original Freddy refers to the original way Freddy was, the original power he had, which was entirely different. He had a completely different power. There were no snares, there were no fake pallets, he didn't have a teleport. His power was simply pulling people into the dream world. And all this really did was allow him to damage them. It gave them a bit of slowdown too, a bit of aura reading if they got too far away, but really it was a very, very weak power. He was incredibly weak, which is part of what led to the whole Sharp Hand Joe meme. But yeah, he was very weak, and that's about it. 100-page clown guide is sort of a meme, but also just a very impressive thing a community member did, which is write a 100+ page guide on the clown. This was sort of viewed at the time as a bit of a meme because Clown was always viewed as sort of this not very complex character, sort of very simplistic and sort of low skill character. So when this 100-page guide came out, everyone sort of kind of found it quite funny. But in reality, it's actually a very impressive guide. It's very detailed. It opens your mind up that Clown is a lot more complex. And it was written by a person named Aranad, I believe. And the guide's still there, you can still go and find the guide. And yeah, I've checked it out before. It's got quite a lot of details, and it's quite interesting to read. I'm personally a bit of a clown hater, but regardless, I do think it's very impressive, and I think the fact they took all that time to go and write that is, you know, it's a lot of dedication, and I think stuff like that in the community really needs to be sort of rewarded and praised. So yeah, I think that's great. Twins PTB. I'm not sure which one I meant to refer to with this because I can think of two Twins PTBs that were terrible. There was the original Twins PTB in 2020 when they first dropped, where everything was broken. And not broken as in powerful, as in broken, it didn't work broken. And this was possibly due to the change in working conditions at the time due to COVID. It was around this time where seemingly the change in working conditions started to affect behavior and the products because a lot of stuff around this time was pretty janky. But I think that's what that was. Basically, there were a ton of issues with Twins. They were clipping into things they shouldn't have. Victor was a complete mess. He was getting stuck in the trial floor. There were lots of just flaws to their kit as well. For example, if you got into a locker against Twins and you were playing as Victor, you couldn't do anything. It was just a complete counter to the character. They just had to wait at that point. And it was this huge counter. It's like, oh, they didn't even think to have Victor, like, you know, have some kind of mechanic to counter this. It's just, oh, you get in a locker, he can't do anything, that's it. It was lots of these sort of huge oversights that were later fixed down the line. The other PTB is the more recent one in 2024, when Twins got their rework, quote-unquote rework. It was mainly just some cooldown reductions and some buffs and stuff, but the original rework was a lot more extensive, and it just buffed Victor up way too much, to the point that the Twins at one point were considered maybe the best characters in the game. Nurse was probably still better, but they were incredibly strong, and it was quite scary. But they ended up not coming out of the PTB like this, so the damage was sort of contained, but it was a very interesting time. Secret Charms refers to the charms that are unavailable to us as players. These are charms such as the Hex No One Escapes Death charm, I think there's one of, and there's also a Translator charm and a few others. And this charm is just a charm that was made, but it's never been released to the game. And it seems to have some criteria to get it, but it's not available to us. So it's just the fact that there's these secret charms in the game that do exist, but they've not been released essentially. Pinhead NFTs refers to a whole controversy around the release of the Hellraiser chapter and Pinhead. And it was the fact that when the character released, alongside it, the license holders, I think it was, released NFTs of Pinhead, and they used the model from Dead by Daylight. And that seems to be where the sort of controversy started. People were upset because when they bought the DLC, they believed they were supporting the NFTs, essentially. I don't think it ended up quite being like that. The whole situation is relatively confusing, but the idea is simply that people were upset buying the chapter and finding out later that this model was being used for NFTs. That's essentially all it was. And it led to lots of review bombing on the Steam store and stuff like that. Chainsaw Myers is a weird anomaly in DBD's past, where Myers was able to pick up a chainsaw, but this wasn't all it was. It was actually all the characters and the ability to swap powers. Chainsaw Myers is simply the most famous of the lot. Basically, every killer was able to drop their power in some aspect due to powers originally being these like carried items, a bit like a survivor carries an item. Originally it was like that, and there was a way to drop your power basically. Not quite sure how it worked, but that's what it was. And it meant that another killer was able to then pick it up, because I think this was also a thing. I'm not quite sure how all this worked, as you can probably tell. But that's it, the basis of what it was. And then another killer could pick it up and they could use the power. So the most famous one was Myers wielding Billy's chainsaw. Or maybe it wasn't that, maybe it was the other bug. I think there was another bug where you could actually change your selected power in the lobby. Maybe it was that, I don't know. I think there was something like that. It was something along those lines, but basically it was a switch in power, which led to some killers having the wrong power. And the most famous one was Myers with a chainsaw, Billy's chainsaw, and it looked really janky as well. The golden t-shirt is technically the rarest cosmetic in DBD, and this was a cosmetic that was won from a tournament on Panda TV, I believe. So it's this golden t-shirt with a Panda TV logo on it. I think it was won by a full Survivor team, if I'm not mistaken. But I think it does actually belong to 4 people. But even so, that makes it the rarest cosmetic in the game you can own. And obviously it's not obtainable anymore. It was only for the winners of that tournament. So that's it. It's sort of fabled though as sort of the actual rarest cosmetic in the game. And I have no idea who actually owns these, or, you know, legitimately. There was a sort of a bug a couple years back where lots of rare cosmetics were leaked to people, like the developer entity shirt or entity sort of tank top and other things like that. So a lot of people got it through that, but it was eventually removed. So the original holders, I'm not too sure of. Cascade refers to the nerf of Pyramid Head's rear. This was a really weird thing, and it was this whole thing that the developers nerfed Pyramid Head's butt, basically. Originally, it was very pronounced, but with a later patch, it seemed to shrink, and everyone was very angry. There were articles written about it, very dramatic. But that's all that really was. It turned out to not even be true. It was just how they modeled or like positioned it or something, and it changed how it looked in game. I think that's all it was. I don't think they ever actually changed it, which was sort of the funny thing. Bubba is getting removed is next up, and this was another sort of misconception. Bubba was never actually planned to be fully removed. Apparently there was an issue with the license at some point. It's all sort of rumor, it's not very clear, but apparently there was an issue at some point with the license, but essentially Behavior figured it out and they made an announcement that Bubba was staying because it was leaked that he was going to be leaving, or that he was likely going to be leaving. And that's all that really is. Oh, and I've just noticed it, I put the teacher again. The teacher and the smasher. Okay. Okay, well, I can talk about the smasher now then, I suppose. The smasher was another character in the game files that was found, another killer. This one doesn't seem to have been bait. This one seems to have been one that was genuinely in development. And this was a character able to actually destroy parts of the trial. like walls and trees and stuff like that. It was an original idea back when there were plans to actually make things destructible potentially too, and it was scrapped just for that reason. That's all that really is. It was a scrapped idea that they decided to not pursue because it would have been far too demanding for the game, and to have a killer breaking parts of the trial would just be too much. It would be very cool, granted, but I think especially back then it would have been way too demanding, probably very hard to code and stuff like that. So it didn't end up happening, but it's this rumored character, or not rumored actually, it's confirmed. I believe the developers have talked about it, but that's what that is. Finally in this tier we have Dredge is a smaller entity, and this is a theory that's come about due to the Dredge consuming people into its fog, much like the entity does. Dredge is just this big massive fog with different parts coming out of it, which isn't too dissimilar from the entity. It also has a similar claw-like appendage and things like that. And that's all this really is that Dredge is this sort of dark embodiment of dark thoughts, and the entity seems to be a relatively similar thing. And they're both these black fogs, only Dredge is a lot smaller. So it's this idea that Dredge is actually just a smaller version of the entity. It did absorb Maurice after all, and it seems Maurice may have had some adventures inside of Dredge, potentially, before his escape, so that's that tier. Now moving on to the next tier, Sabotage Bear Traps. This was something that existed back in the day, and it was essentially the fact that trappers' bear traps could be sabotaged. And this didn't just mean you could sort of shut them like you do now, disarm them, it meant you could completely break them. When you sabotaged them, they became completely unusable for the rest of the match. Is pretty crazy. Fake vaults was a bug a couple years ago, I think, and it essentially allowed you to run up to a vault, and when you vaulted, you clicked your flashlight at the same time and looked in a different direction, and it almost looked like you were vaulting, but then it flew you off to a different angle. So you could run up to a vault going straight, and when you went to vault it, you directed a different way and went to the right, say, if you aimed right. I think you had to click right, maybe. Click your flashlight in the way you wanted. So you could literally fake the vault animation, did half the animation, vaulting over, but then you got turned in a different way. It was this really weird bug, and it was quite powerful. Plague's Eye refers to the fact that one of her eyes don't actually blink or move at all, and I believe this is the infected one. And that's all that really is that in some cosmetics you can see both her eyes are more visible, and that one eye doesn't actually move or blink. Parkour refers to the fact that parkour was originally planned for the game. Back in the old alpha and prototype builds, there's actually a lot going on with parkour. There were plans to have survivors able to run up a lot higher onto buildings and on top of the car stacks on Autohaven wreckers and stuff like that, and they'd be able to run on top of those and jump between them, do parkour. This is probably also a similar era to the whole Smasher concepts. They wanted, destructible scenery. They wanted you to be able to climb and do parkour. They're all things that just didn't quite make it because they wouldn't have made sense, really. Hag Cannon is a bug that's been around for quite some time now, and it's a bug that allows you to shoot yourself up into the skybox and what looks to be space on some maps, like a Dead Dog Saloon. To do this, you need to set your hag trap and have the add-on Scarred Hand, which makes your traps have collision. And then you need a survivor to come along and drop down onto the trap from a higher elevation. And this will then cause them to spin really, really fast and shoot up into the air. And from here, you remain in the skybox and eventually just despawn, and it counts as you getting sacrificed. So that's what that is. A lot of people think that could be the third way to escape the trial. That rumored way to escape the trial could be this, but I don't think it is because it seems pretty clearly like a bug. It's also not very grounded within the sort of the realm of the game's universe. I think it's just one of those things they've not patched. At least I don't think they have yet, because it's not particularly disruptive to gameplay. How often is this realistically going to happen in an actual game? Not very often, is the truth behind it. Official tournament disaster. This refers to the last official tournament I think Behavior did, and this was back in, I think, like 2017 or 2018. And it was basically just a big disaster. I think particularly with the commentators, they didn't really know what the game was. They were saying things that sounded quite amateurish, like commenting on the fact that Billy uses his chainsaw to traverse the map and not just down survivors, something that's sort of blatantly evident if you've played the game for even a short time. So this was viewed as just a bit of a disaster. It was also just, I think, quite a mess in the organization. There was lots of sort of lag and different issues, I think. Exploding hatchets is a bug early on with Huntress, I believe, where when she threw her hatchets, they would make this really loud exploding sound. And that's pretty much all it is, I think. They just made this really loud, annoying sound, and it got patched out. Hatch standoff refers to originally how Hatch used to work. On the original Hatch, you were actually able to grab survivors whilst they were jumping in. So whilst they were doing the animation of jumping into the hatch, you could actually reach out and grab them and pull them onto your shoulder. Or just onto the floor maybe even, I'm not too sure. And this was a big issue, of course, as it led to hatch standoffs, because for one, the hatch couldn't be closed at this point in time. This was, I think, pre-2019 maybe. So what happened was, if the killer found the hatch first, they would walk up to the hatch and they would have to just wait by it. And so when the survivor came over, there would be a standoff. The survivor couldn't jump into the hatch because the killer would grab them, and the killer couldn't do anything aside wait because they couldn't shut the hatch. This led to long periods of time where the two of them would simply face down and wait for someone to do something. If the killer took a swing, the survivor would be able to get into the hatch because they'd be locked in the wiping animation. If the survivor jumped in, the killer could grab them. So it was sort of a standoff. It took good timing to win these, but for the most part, they would have probably ended in the killer grabbing the survivor. DBD board game. This is just referencing the fact that a DBD board game does in fact exist. It came about around a year or two ago now via a Kickstarter campaign. I think it was Kickstarter, or it was a similar site to that. And lots of people bought it and funded into it. I did buy it myself as well, actually. It's not too bad. It's quite different, obviously, because DBD is sort of tough to transfer to a board game, but it plays relatively well, and it's quite cool. P100 voice lines refers to the fact that some characters have Prestige 100 voice lines. Currently, these are sort of the only direct reward you can get for actually reaching Prestige 100. And the two I can think of off the top of my head are for Nicolas Cage, who when you hit Prestige 100, he goes crazy and does a bunch of crazy noises. He goes like, blah, 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 blah. And then there's also Naughty Bear, and the narrator comments on, I think, Naughty Bear like doing well or something. Flashlight nerf. This is referring to when flashlights got their big nerf, from insta blinds down to sort of just when they became kind of average and were sort of more normalized. And this happened after a game where Matthew Cote played as Hag against a team of players, and they flashlight blinded him a bunch of times. And lots of people think this game was the reason for the flashlight nerf. Like, the developers before didn't think it was such an issue, but then after this game, they got nerfed, and so everyone accredits it to this. This probably isn't the case, realistically at least. I think it's sort of a funny theory, but I think it's probably not true. Pride Charm and Flashlight. This refers to the fact that if you shine your flashlight on a prime charm on a hook, it comes out in different colors of the rainbow, depending where you're shining your flashlight. So that's just a cool little secret that the developers added in. So that's pretty cool. 7 Days intro refers to the secret intro you can unlock after buying the Sadako DLC. If you buy the Sadako DLC 7 days later, a bit like Sadako's 7-day tape, a DPD version of the cursed tape will play as part of the intro of the game. This only happens once, you can only see this once, and it happens 7 days after, or it's triggered 7 days after you've bought the DLC. Victor is a Baby is sort of an early controversy around the time and release of the twins, when lots of people, when they came out, thought he was a baby because of how small he was and how he, to be fair, sort of looks like one, even though he is technically the same age as Charlotte. This was also partly down to the fact that I think originally twins were planned to be a pregnant mother and her child, but it was later changed to be conjoined siblings. And basically there was just a lot of controversy around this because obviously you can't have violence toward children in video games, so it was sort of a bit of an issue, I think, for behavior to have lots of people referring to Victor as a baby, going around kicking the baby. There was a common phrase back then of kick the baby, which meant to kick Victor. Safe rooms. This refers to the fact that on the RPD map, there are certain areas where you'll hear different music than the regular music or the regular backing track within the trials. And these are where the safe rooms are located, or where the typewriters are located. There's one in what I think is the warden's office, or that sort of lounge area, when you go up the stairs and to the right from the main hall. And then the other one is in the sort of photo processing room, which is up the main stairs to the left, down the stairs, and the first room on the left. And yeah, it's just a cool little Easter egg and reference to the Resident Evil games, which also have safe rooms which play this sort of calming music, and it's always the rooms with a typewriter, which is where the save points are in those games. Boil over meta refers to a period of time where boil over was meta. It wasn't, this one's a bit debatable because it wasn't necessarily meta, it wasn't a particularly efficient tactic, it was just very punishing and annoying and sort of uncounterable. And this was on RPD, but the old RPD, back when you could go on the upper floor of the library. Up here, there was only one route down, I believe, or there was maybe two. There was a drop down and there was the stairs. But there was also a totem up here too, which you could put in the very back corner of the library. And this allowed you to put a boon in there. I believe you could put in Circle of Healing, but also Exponential. And there was a boil over change at the time where they changed boil over so you could charge up a very large amount, I think, of your... I don't remember exactly what it was, but essentially it made it very difficult to get out of that area because if you drop down, you added a lot to the wiggle bar. I think it was like 33% or something. It meant that it was basically impossible to hook anyone if you sat in that very back corner. And if you downed them, they just revived with the totem or unbreakable, or they healed each other. As a 4-stack this was. And there was only, I think, one hook available in the library, and to go down the stairs way, you couldn't quite make it, especially if people body blocked, and to go down the drop down way, you couldn't either because of boil over. And it made this really sort of toxic strategy where the killer essentially couldn't hook anyone. And then it was nerfed pretty soon after. It has a similar-ish effect now, but it doesn't add a flat percentage. It adds, I think, a percentage of your overall wiggle progression currently. So depending on how much you've wiggled, it adds a percentage of that, rather than it just being a flat percentage, which is what it did before. Splinters refers to the old free DLC the game had. These were offerings you could use that allowed you to play as killers for just one game, without add-ons or perks. So you would play as a character you owned, say Trapper, and you could put on a Splinter offering, say for the Doctor, which was called like an electrified Splinter or something, and then you would load into the game, you'd queue as Trapper, just have this offering on, and you would load into the game as Doctor, but with no perks, no add-ons. It was a means to let you try out different characters. These were iridescent offerings, and they were one use and allowed you to play as the character for just a single game to try them out. It was quite a good system. It ended up getting removed, I think, due to a bug and allowing people to, I think it was like permanently use characters, or it was some other related issue, but it meant they had to be removed. The Observer's death, which happened back in tome 10 or something maybe, I forget the exact tome, there was this idea that the Observer died. He was no longer in his tower. If you go into the archives, his chair is empty, and everyone assumed he was dead, especially after we saw the cutscene from that tome. However, the Observer is not dead. He's actually currently in the void, exploring it and looking for a way out. So this whole thing is basically just a big myth, but it's also a sort of widely spread one. Everyone thinks the Observer's dead. You probably don't if you've read more of the lore, but I think the wider community has this belief that the Observer is dead. No longer in the tower, he was killed. The Soldier Killer refers to what the clown originally was. That's all this really is that clown was originally going to be a soldier, and his bottles were going to be sort of like gas grenades or something. And that's all we really know, I think. That's the depth of that, and it was changed to be the clown. This may have been because of behavior split from Starbreeze, who prior didn't let them make a clown, I think. Or they disagreed on that issue, I think. So when they did split, behavior decided to make a clown killer. What the Fog is a game that came out just last year and was announced during, I think, the anniversary stream. And it's sort of this little game you could play within the universe of DBD, where you run around as these sort of animated versions of the core Survivor characters. It's very bizarre. It sort of, I'm not too sure what the point of it was or why they released it. It seemed like maybe it should have been more of a mobile game or something. I'm not too sure. But it died out very quickly and it's been almost instantly forgotten, so it's been included here. Sexist Vaults refers to the fact that there was a point in time where, depending on if you were playing a male or female character, the vault distance, so the distance you got after vaulting, would be different. So people named this Sexist Vaults because this also did happen a few times. There were a few patches where this reappeared. I think it was the male characters who would be able to get a bit more distance, and the female characters would get a bit less. And this may not seem too impactful, but it did make a difference in cases like facing Trapper. When you faced Trapper, there were times when you could actually get over a trap as a male character, but there were times you wouldn't get over as a female character. So it did have somewhat of an impact on the game. Not too much, granted, but it did have a small impact. Alright, so that's going to do it for today. We currently have 4 tiers remaining. That was part 2 of the iceberg. I do hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching,